partnership with the Dallas Police Department and the FBI, she has co-founded the annual National Conference on Crimes Against Women, which trains law enforcement prosecutors and advocates on the most effective and advanced cutting-edge techniques and strategies in the investigation of crimes against women and in the prosecution of those perpetrators. In 2009, Jan finished a presidential appointment as the Senior Policy Advisor to the Director of the United States Department of Justice on Violence Against Women. I mean, that's a mouthful. And we're just so glad that she was able to come back to our community from that in one piece and again pick up the mantle of everything that she does here. We're so proud of her. The McCormick Lecture Series has just been a blessing to this church, and we're so grateful to Mac and Barbara for founding the endowment that really pays for the whole event. And it's just one of 32 different endowments that the foundation has that sponsors all kinds of activities in terms of benevolence and outreach and missions, and campus repair and maintenance is our biggest service, education, other lecture series. We have the SHIP lecture series, which alternates with the McCormick in the fall. So next fall will be the SHIP lecture series, and we'll have a clergy speaker at SHIP. We always have a lay speaker at McCormick. We sponsored the music department. Almost any big event you go to that our music program puts on, we helped underwrite it, oftentimes bringing in the guest vocalists and guest members of the orchestra. We sponsored the Visual Arts Committee, which runs the art program in Watson Hall with rotating art shows. And we help the church with technology, and we also sort of run the shepherd's garden outside. When I took this job, no one told me I was going to become a mortician. So I help with the columbarium out there, and the foundation underwrites the total cost of that. So we're honored to have Jan again today. Jan, would you like to introduce your guest
Yes,
today?
I would. First of all, I want to thank you, Paul, for inviting me and coordinating all of this, and your lay team has just been incredible. And of course, Dr. Stan Copeland, who was generous enough to let me walk to the podium to the pulpit 3 times yesterday. It was a great day. I'm exhausted. I don't know how he does it every Sunday. But I got to tell you, I have been a Methodist my whole life, as you may have heard, and have been at different churches in the city. But I got to tell you, you guys are onto something. I've never seen spirit like I saw here yesterday. I am so impressed with the diversity in this church. I love the African mission. I love the deaf ministry. I love the Thrive service. And I'm a pretty traditional worship person. And so I got to tell you, I was standing up, raising my hands, clapping my hands yesterday. I was impressed with myself. You even got me to do that. But I love the crosswalk. I love the Thrive service, and then of course the traditional service. You guys are incredible and a beacon for this community of Methodism, beacon of Methodism. I'm excited to be back here this morning, and the fact that you showed up after possibly hearing me all day yesterday is really impressive to me, but I've brought the big guns with me today. I'm excited for you to meet Jordan Tidwell Lawson. She is an amazing person. I like her. I just like her. But she came to Genesis about 7.5 years ago as one of my children's therapists, an expert, a gifted clinician. She very quickly moved up to being the Assistant Director of Clinical and Professional Services. We know that we have such a responsibility to victims who reach out to us to make sure that our services are the best that they can be, that we're doing cutting-edge clinical work. And Jordan really has elevated those services as Assistant Director of Clinical and Professional Services. And a few months ago, we have promoted her yet once again. She's now Director of all Residential Services. So she oversees the clients and the operations of our shelter, which is a 40-bed shelter in a secret location, but also our transitional housing apartment complex, which sits right behind on that same safe campus, where our school and our daycare and our childcare and our on and on and on is also housed, but where folks can stay for 6 weeks at the shelter. They can then move into transitional housing where they can stay a year, and because of support like we get from Lovers Lane Methodist Church, all of those services are no cost, no strings attached. As I mentioned, she's a gifted clinician. She did her undergraduate, she's a West Texas Texas girl, did her undergraduate work at Texas Tech, did her graduate work at Wayland Baptist College. And so she's here today to kind of, like I say, I can do the flash, but she's going to do the substance today. And so we're going to kick this off. And I want to be sure that we're going to leave some time. Paul, are we out at 11? I think we're done at 11. I'm going to definitely leave some time for questions, or if you have questions as we go along, we want you to do that. Or if anything was kind of left over from last night and you want to talk about that, we're happy to do that as well. But I want to, periodically yesterday, I kept throwing in statistics that continued, in my opinion, to be very, very alarming. That 1 out of every 3 women you pass will know domestic violence. That translates out to every 9 seconds. Every 9 seconds, a woman is battered by someone who tells her he loves her, by someone who tells her it's her fault. And in the time that we're here sharing today, that's 1 hour and if you start dividing that, that's 350 moms and 350 moms and sisters and friends. 12 people will die today. 12 people will die today as a result of domestic violence. Now, if I've done my math correctly, by Friday, by Wednesday, actually, if I'm doing my math correctly in this room, that will be the equivalent of every single person sitting in this room. Every single day. That's too much. That's just too much. You know, the Dallas police actually respond to over almost 20,000 domestic violence calls every year. 20,000. Now think about that. If there was an infection or Al-Qaeda or somebody who came into our city and there were 20,000 calls to the city, we'd bring in the Centers for Disease Control. We'd bring in the U.S. Marshals. We'd bring in anything we could to make our community safe, and yet this continues to go unreported, untalked about so often. And I mentioned a stat yesterday that even if we think, okay, that's not me and that's not anybody I know, we also know that 85% of men in Texas prisons grew up in a violent home. Now, they're not there because they committed domestic violence. They're there because they stole your car. They're there because they broke into the Ace Hardware store. They're there because they tried to sell drugs to our kiddos. That's why they are in prison. But I guarantee they did not learn that violence out in the street. They learned it in the home, and it spilled out into the street. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women in the United States, but also the rippling effects of that, and Jordan's going to talk about in the next generation, but even the rippling effects as adults. You need to hear that domestic violence is the #1 push factor into human trafficking. A lot of talk about human trafficking, a lot of talk about human smuggling, and I don't know if you know the difference. Smuggling is they're coming in from someplace else, but the scourge of human trafficking in our country is this underbelly human slavery that, again, it's a terrible situation. But let me tell you, a 13-year-old girl doesn't decide that it's safer walking Harry Hines in the middle of the night if it's safe in her own home. So we know that 99% of those girls and boys who are prostituted by someone grew up in a violent home. We know that about 98% of those who prostitute others grew up in a violent home. So if we want to address human trafficking, if we want to address teen runaway, if we want to address teen drug use or teen suicide, which the outreach that you guys do in that area, we need to talk about the violence that's perpetrated in their own homes. We also know that when we do a crossover, when we do a layover of the mass shootings and domestic violence, it's stunning. You take a look at Pulse nightclub, you take a look at the Boston Marathon bomber, you take a look at Parkland, Florida, you take a look at Sutherland Springs, Texas, and even the Mikkel Johnson, I think was his name, that shot the police officers in downtown Dallas a couple of years ago. If you look at all of them, the history is the same. It is a violence toward women. The guy downtown Dallas had a history of sexual assault in the military. The guy in Sutherland Springs, Texas, I mentioned him yesterday a couple of times, who went to church on that day to kill his wife and his mother-in-law, and they were not there. They're always on the first row at First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs. They weren't there that day, and so he killed everybody else. I mean, we're not safe from this if we just think, oh, I'm safe because it's not in my house. We need to know it can be the next person who walks in the door at Lovers Lane United Methodist Church. But if you look at all those histories, the Pulse nightclub, history of violence against his wife, And the Parkland, Florida, I don't know if you remember that, where the young student walked into his school, they kept saying, oh, he had been expelled, he had been expelled. Well, the reason he had been expelled was for assaulting the girlfriend that wouldn't go out with him. And so he came back and killed our children, killed our children. So if we want to look at ending mass shooting, or like I say, teen drug use or teen suicide or human trafficking, let's start with what's going on in the home. One of the things we didn't talk about yesterday that I want to share with you is the whole concept of why does he do that? Why is somebody abusive like that? And the truth of the matter is, people think it's about a fight that got out of control. I can tell you what it's not. It's not about a fight that got out of control, and it's not a one-time incident. This is all about power and control. It's not about I had a bad day at the office. It's not about look what you made me do. It's not about all the excuses that are given. It literally is someone saying, I'm in charge and you're not, and you're going to do what I say when I say it. There's actually a diagram, and I wish I'd brought it today, but if you think in terms of a bicycle wheel, a tire, the very axle is the power and control that one person thinks they have the right to hold over another person. And then if you think of the spokes, how do they hold that power? Well, it may be through intimidation. I'm the boss and you're not. It may be through triangulating the children. Go tell your mother this dinner tastes like crap, you know. It may be through financial compensatory power. He may not let her go to church. He may isolate her from her family and her support system by moving her to another town. But again, with that analogy, you've got these spokes going out from that power and control, but the tire of that bicycle tire itself, the rubber part, is actually the physical and sexual and emotional abuse that keeps it round instead of being lopsided with kind of like a flat tire. It keeps that round. We call it the power and control wheel. We also know another tricky sort of dynamic is that it's not violent all the time. There is another illustration, if you'll bear with me. I should have brought that as well, I'm sorry. But we call it the cycle of violence. We have so many people who think of their relationship as linear, almost like I'm mapping the history of Oklahoma, you know, and I don't know the history of Oklahoma, so bear with me. But it's like, back here there were the Native American, whatever, and then in came the conquistadors, and then down here was the statehood, and down here was the gold rush or oil rush or whatever, and then boom, there was the Oklahoma City bombing. Pray to God that never happens again, and you move on down the history of Oklahoma. A lot of people in a violent relationship think those episodes are on a linear scale. This is where he pushed me. This is where he shoved me. This is where I fell down the stairs. This is where he slapped me and screamed at me. Oh, this one, that's when I had the concussion and was in the hospital for 2 days. And they think that their relationship just keeps going on and on. What we know at Genesis is that if we could attach those two ends, we find this cycle of his behavior, which starts with a tension-building period, and we've all got that. I mean, some of us more than others, I think, but we all have tension in our relationships because we're human beings, right? But then in a dysfunctional and against the law episode, it moves into the actual assault, the physical assault. It can be verbal, but what's against the law is the physical assault. And I never cease to be amazed at how one person can hurt another. Just when I think I've seen it all, I'm like, wait, he used a sander on her, an electric sander? He did what with that body? I mean, it's just unbelievable. But that is followed by what we call the honeymoon period, a period of calm, a period of I promise I'll never do it again, a period of maybe he gave me a present, or in high school, he took me to the dance, or he sent me flowers, or he put a teddy bear in the front seat of my car while I was in class today. And then at that time, we're thinking, okay, gosh, maybe it's going to be okay. But what we know is it goes back into the tension, into the assault, into the honeymoon, again and again and again. I was out at Hockaday not long ago, and I told those little girls, this is how I know, how I'm absolutely convinced if he hits you once, he'll hit you again. Because we know not only will the amount of time between the episodes decrease, the severity will increase. So we don't want to ignore that first push, because that leads to a slap, and that slap leads to a punch, and that punch maybe leads to strangulation, and that strangulation can eventually lead to a homicide. A lot of times, we kind of sort of blow off the seriousness of a misdemeanor court. I'm sorry. Judge and I were just talking about some of the criminal response to this issue, this particular issue, which he's seen at his bench, in front of his bench many times. And so I at first used to think, well, let's get in the felony court. Let's get tough up there. But I got news. I heard, in fact, Judge, I heard a prosecutor once say, a good prosecutor can prosecute a homicide. A great prosecutor can prevent it. So we need to put our efforts into that first slap and that first punch and try to. This is a crime we can prevent. So the dynamics are pretty interesting. We know it's pervasive. We know it doesn't happen all the time, but it will happen again. And we know that it is all about power and control. It's not about he had too much to drink. There are a lot of drunks who do not hit their wives. There are a lot of guys who hit their wives who don't drink. And so we don't want to blame it on that. We blame it on a choice and the beliefs that I talked about yesterday that he feels like he has, or talked about last night. He has the right to have whatever he wants. Mm-hmm. He has the belief that she's responsible to get it for him, and he has the right to hurt her if she doesn't. So I want to jump into this a little more deeply, and I want to chat with Jordan about several things. One of the things, when I first went to Genesis, I want you to know this almost 30 years ago, we responded to victims of violence with what's called a medical model. Someone would come to us, we'd say, what's wrong with you? She says, I can't eat, I can't sleep, and I'm triggered by the smell of coffee. And we'd say, fine, come on in. I've got a safe shelter, I've got an advocate, I've got a counselor, I can get you a job, I can get you an apartment, I can get you some clothes, and you'll be okay. That's what's called a medical model. We know now, we know better now, that when somebody presents to us, those things are not enough. Because this person perhaps has been hit in the head with an emotional 2x4, not one time, but for 15 straight years. They have lived in the Boston Marathon bombing every day of their marriage. Mm-hmm. So now she presents to us, and we know better, and we say, she tells us, I can't eat, I can't sleep, and I'm triggered by the smell of coffee. And we say, what's happened to you? Not what's wrong with you, what's happened to you? And we begin to walk beside her. I would love for Jordan to take a jump into this sort of trauma piece. I've heard so many people, Jordan, say, you know, the sexual assault was bad, but the trauma that was after that, the aftermath of that was the worst part of it. Would you talk to us about the impact of verbal and emotional violence and physical violence and sexual violence on somebody who is experiencing this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you've probably all heard the term trauma. It's kind of a buzzword in our world right now. It's kind of a trendy term, and I don't know that a lot of people have done an adequate job of explaining it, because typically when we hear it in the context of an emotion, right? I'm traumatized, so I feel this way. But what we actually know is that trauma is a neurological response to threat. And so what's really interesting that we've learned through the neuroscience behind this is when somebody experiences danger, when they experience some sort of sensation of threat, and I would ask you to think of threat as being two things. One being a physical threat, so I genuinely fear for my life. I'm afraid that somebody's going to hurt me. And the other one being kind of a threat to my way of life, my understanding of life and my identity. Something has happened to me, somebody has done something to me, and it's really threatening the way I understand my world, and I kind of conceptualize my world. And if something threatens those two areas, it actually can have a deep neurological impact on somebody. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala that functions like a smoke detector, and it should be off like most smoke detectors 99% of the time unless there's smoke, threat, right? And if it senses smoke, threat, it'll blare off and it'll tell us there's danger, and it'll help us react in a way that'll help us survive, right? The problem is that if the amygdala gets exposed to threat multiple times, it becomes too sensitive. And it actually kind of stays in a level of on all the time, right? So out of absolute respect and care and love for our military, I'm going to use them as an example of what we're talking about. If you have a veteran who's gone overseas to a combat situation, I have learned from a friend who was overseas that, let's say he or she was deployed for 100 days, we can assume that he may have been exposed to combat, threat-like situations for 50 of those days, okay? And so for 50 of those days, he survived by every time he heard a noise that was threatening, sounded like a gunshot, sounded like somebody coming, he kind of dropped behind a wall and got in a position to protect himself, right? So then he comes home, is returned to his home and in his safe neighborhood, walking down the street, and so hears the door close. And what do you guys think happens? His brain, his amygdala that got really sensitive to that sound of threat, reacted quickly in a protective manner, and he got behind something and got into a position of protection, right? And so what Jan and I would put before you is, that's really important to understand about domestic violence victims, is if she lives in her home for 100 days, 100 days are combat situations. 100 days are her kind of trying to be ahead and look out for what's going to happen next, what's he saying, what mood's he in, where is he, what's going on. And so for 100 days, she's exposed to the feeling or the concern of threat. And the impact that can have on our clients is really, really, really devastating and destructive. It leaves our clients in a place where they are constantly on guard. They are constantly in the world around them, not just with their abusive partner, but with the world. Their brain is literally functioning in a place of protection at all times. And if you're constantly trying to protect yourself, there are kind of two downsides to that. One is that you're not able to really think things through very well and able to kind of forward think. The concern of that is it's really hard to make goals and it's really hard to achieve those goals, right? For our kiddos, it's really hard to learn and it's really hard to retain and internalize information because their brain is so focused on survival. And the second one is that if you're constantly looking out for where's the threat, it means that you feel that the world around you is threatening. And so you perceive threat from everybody around you. It's kind of like your brain went from when is he going to hurt me next to who's going to hurt me next. And so our clients have a really hard time interacting with the world around them because they are constantly in worry of being hurt again. And this really impacts, like we said, it impacts their ability to get employment and keep employment.
Have relationships,
Learn, grow, change, because literally they are living their lives day by day only to survive.
You know, last night, and I'm glad you brought that up because I want to ask you this question. There was a gentleman at the dinner last night, and he was talking about a relative, somebody in his family, and he knows that she is in need of help, but won't tell, won't get out, won't trust him, and it's kind of hard when you're a friend, but maybe that just explained it to me, that she doesn't just think might hurt her. Your whole world becomes, somebody else may hurt me too. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Right?
I think the reason that, if we're talking about why a victim may stay in an abusive relationship or why she may do, the truth is, and Jan and I can be really honest, there are times where victims do things that may seem really confusing or might seem counterproductive to those that are not in her situation. But what we know is that her brain is literally focused second by second on how to survive that moment. And then what kind of happens is she develops techniques and strategies to survive that home and those moments and that situation. And so she gets really, for lack of a better word, comfortable surviving this. And I'm really uncomfortable surviving the unknown. I don't know what's going to happen over here. So in some ways, it is this kind of idea of, this is just where I have to be because this is what I can survive.
Right. There's a lot of big terms that my clinicians use. One of them is cognitive dissonance, and it's the thought of two things that are different, don't mix together. And to give you an example, if you think of Aesop's fable, the fox and the sour grapes, the fox is walking down the road and he's hungry, all right, he's hungry. He looks up and he sees grapes in the tree. He wants the grapes, but they're up too high and he can't get them. So you may remember this fable. The fox says, well, they're probably sour anyway. So we see clients who come and say, I'm afraid to go or tell. I'm afraid to stay and live in this. And so you know what? Gosh, maybe he won't ever do it again. So there's lots going on below the surface.
Absolutely. It gets really complicated, too, because, he is threatening that if she leaves, something really horrible will happen. We know that the most dangerous time for a woman is when she leaves an abusive relationship. She's 70 times more likely to be killed once she's left. But actually, one of the responses of the amygdala is this kind of state of frozenness. And we all kind of do this. If everybody in the room could confess right now, how many of you have had something really stressful or really hard you needed to deal with, and you kind of did that, I'll do it later. I'm not really in the mood to take care of it right now, right? And so this is kind of that avoidance or frozen reaction from the amygdala part of the brain. And so magnify that by 100,000. And a lot of times our clients will be in a sensation of frozenness because I don't know what to do, and any option that I can identify seems to have consequences or
Right.
fear associated with it, so I'm just going to freeze and not do anything.
So I've heard you talk and our staff talk a lot about with our kiddos, they refer to they do this is my amygdala, but their prefrontal cortex is in front of it. Your prefrontal cortex is where you process cause and effect, where you process memory, you can think of a plan, you can have your cognitive thinking, but it disconnects when you're in danger. It disconnects when you are almost in a car wreck, or that it's meant to do that, and our little kids call it, I flipped my lid, and now my amygdala won't let me learn in school. And so when that amygdala, if I'm explaining this correctly, when the prefrontal cortex re-engages and I'm put on the stand, I don't remember, because I remember I'd flipped my lid in trying to survive. And so somebody's like, was it a Coke can or a Coke bottle he threw at you? I'm like, I don't know. Hey, if you all have not watched this, there's a new show on Netflix, Unbelievable. Have you seen it? Wow. It is unbelievable. It's a series, like 5-6 parts have any of you all seen it? Oh my gosh, it's pretty raw. But it's a serial sexual offender. And but what was so interesting to people like us is not only the affect afterwards. One is, I don't know if it's real or I dreamed it. Another one is laughing the whole time, and you're thinking, what's wrong with you? I mean, the affect of what happens to a traumatized person. Have you ever been in a thing, I'm so mad, I burst into tears, or I start laughing when I'm so mad? Those are the kinds of things that we see in this show. And the other thing is how different people interview them. The nurse in the hospital who was so cold, the one cop was great, and so on and so forth. So this is what these people are trying to navigate.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I would put forward when we speak to people is, in my clinical work and in the treatment of trauma, I will tell you guys, victims tend to be able to heal and move forward through the literal event of what happened in a pretty appropriate clinical fashion, right? So a couple, 8 to 10 sessions, and they can really move forward and feel better about the event of physical abuse or the event of sexual trauma that they experience. But I'll be honest with you, the trauma that they really feel stuck in and really emote a lot and have a hard time moving past is what we call the trauma of the trauma. And what that was is the way people responded to them when they told them that it happened, or when they asked for help and somebody didn't believe them, or when the police officer was really rude to them and said, well, what did you do to make them mad? Or when somebody told them, well, you just shouldn't tell people about this, move on. That kind of trauma of the trauma, people's reactions, is one that really lingers. It's really hard for people to move through. It's the people that they felt like really let them down or really blamed them. And so it's the guilt and hurt and shame that they've perceived from those experiences that they really have a hard time.
And all the more important, we're going to talk about how to help a friend in a little bit, but it's all more important that you don't have to fix it. You don't have to be a therapist. You just say, I'm sorry, and I believe you, and I want to help you, and I'm here for you. Those are the kinds of things we just need to write on the back of our hand. Jordan, so many times there are kids in the home when this is going on. Will you talk about the impact on children and the trauma they experience just by, many are victims themselves, but just watching mom as she is hurt in the home?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing that we would just put forward is the understanding that if domestic violence is happening in the home, child abuse is occurring in the home. It doesn't mean that the child is directly being abused, but they are experiencing at the very least the emotional abuse of living in a threatening environment, an unsafe space. And so because of that, we know children who experience trauma, again, it being a neurological event, not just an emotional reaction, they're really impacted in all areas of their life. The earlier that trauma occurs, the more that it can impact development, and it can really delay or even stop development from kids. And so we have children that we interact with who are 16, but they really present like a 10-year-old because of the time in which their trauma occurred. And so they really haven't had the ability to mature cognitively or emotionally because that part of their brain was impacted by the event that they went through. We know that it has what we call psychosomatic effect, which means it really impacts their bodies. Kids raised in abuse are 11 times more likely to have asthma. They have headaches. They have stomach aches. We actually recently had a 4-year-old in shelter who had stomach ulcers. And if
4
you,
years old and he had stomach ulcers. Isn't that
Right.
something?
I think unfortunately it's just the perfect example of what that home is like, because
Right.
he really can't cognitively understand what's going on around him. Mom really says that for majority of the incidences he was in his room, he was out of it and he didn't see much.
Yeah.
But what we know is he felt it, right? Anybody ever had that awkward family experience at Thanksgiving where like there's just tension in the room? You're like, so you felt that heaviness? That
They know.
times 1,000 is what the home feels like, and that stress can actually impact kids' bodies so greatly that this little 4-year-old developed stomach ulcers.
Yeah. So what is our approach? Tell them about the approach with regards to how to help them heal and how to help them heal with mom.
Absolutely. So at Genesis, clinically, we really value evidence-based modalities that are going to proven to treat the trauma that these kids have been through, the symptoms that they're living with. And so first and foremost, our clinical team works from an attachment model. And what that means is we recognize that the trauma has not just been individual, but it's been to the family as a whole. And so we're really working with the safe parent and the kid together to kind of heal the attachment. One of the ways that I explain it is if in the home, mom was always having to keep one eye on him, on the abuser, to stay safe and try to see what was going on, that only left her one eye for her kids. And I don't know about you, but I would like to give 2 eyes to my kids. I need to, or
Me
they're
too, for those boys.
destroying things. So at the very least, it's broken the attachment a little bit because she wasn't able to give everything to them, all of the attention to them. She was having to be present for the abuser to keep things safe. So we work on the attachment between mom and kid. And then we use skills such as trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. We use a type of therapy called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And these 2 treatments are, again, evidence-based and proven to reduce symptoms of PTSD, which is what we're talking about the impact of trauma being, and really are meant to move forward in the development of this child and really help them grow and learn and heal from what they've been through.
You know, another thing that I'm asked so often, and victims, survivors will come to Genesis and say, well, you know, he promises this time it won't happen again. Now, again, we know this cycle of violence, and that's this whole stage, and she doesn't quite understand that yet. But he says he'll change, but can he really? Is the question we have. So maybe you could walk us through those thoughts.
It's a really complicated question, especially sitting in a church where we believe in redemption and we believe in change and we believe in
forgiveness.
Absolutely. So here is how I would simply say it. Yes, he can change, but he probably won't. He absolutely can change. Behaviors can be changed. And what we know is that domestic violence, as you said earlier, it's not happening because there's something wrong with him. It's happening because he's choosing to act this way. And at its root, domestic violence is the power and control that comes from entitlement. I believe I'm entitled to get what I want. I believe I'm entitled to have power over somebody else. And so if he was willing to go through a really strenuous process of addressing those issues of entitlement, of getting down to the root of it and really being honest and open with the fact that he's not entitled to get what he wants, if he was willing to do the work of understanding how to sit with disappointment, not get his way, and just feel that, because we all do that, right? Nobody likes to be told no. That's not great. I like to get my way. But we've experienced that. We didn't get our way, and we just had to kind of feel it and move on, right? He doesn't know how to experience that feeling, and so he will make somebody give him what he wants so he doesn't have to feel that way. So what I would tell you is that because the root work takes a lot and is really hard, it's highly likely that he won't change. We know that of men who are offender in the court system, statistically 96% of them will re-offend and be back in the court system. Optimists in the rooms are looking at it and saying 4% change.
Yeah.
The problem is that that statistic was based on those that came back into the court system. We know that there are a lot of abusive behaviors that aren't necessarily illegal.
Right.
And so he potentially is still being abusive. It's just not being reported. He
changed his behavior. If he knows he's going back to jail again, because there's a law that says if he reoffends if 2 misdemeanors in the same 12 months, then that can bump it up to a felony. It's called continuous family violence or something. And so maybe he knows I can't hit her, but I gall darn want dinner on the table at the right time, and so maybe he chooses another weapon.
Absolutely. What we see often, and what I explore with my clients a lot who are trying to see this, is we see that rooted change is not actually occurring, but shifting is occurring. And so what happens is he knows that this behavior might get this consequence, and he's smart enough to know, I don't want that consequence again. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to pay all these fines. And so he's going to shift the behavior to a different abusive tactic in order to still dominate and have power and control, still get his way. It's just not the same. And a lot of times victims have a hard time with this because they're very much looking at this behavior. They know they don't want this to happen again.
Right.
And so they're looking for this to happen again, and it's not. So they think, oh, change is happening.
And I think it's up to the victim. I've heard you say this. It's up to the victim to say, well, that's good enough for me. Because if I know I have to leave my home and I won't have support and I won't have these things, I won't have help with the kids or whatever it is, I'm okay if he just doesn't hit me. And so I stay longer.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really hard for those of us that really care about people in this situation and really want them to be safe is we really want to believe that leaving will fix it and it'll make it better. And the reality is that we know oftentimes leaving might make it worse, might make her be in more danger in kind of a worse situation, if you will. So oftentimes clients are grappling with, do I stay in this situation or do I go and have these kind of issues and consequences, especially if kids are involved.
Right.
I'm still connected to him.
I still have to meet him every Wednesday night. I still have to turn my kids over unchaperoned for 2 weeks in the summer.
And
I'm not gonna
recently
do
we've
it.
had several incidences around our country where women were killed during visitation drop-offs, so it's not safer just because she left. And so oftentimes I'm working with a client who's trying to identify, things have shifted in my home. Is this safe enough? Can I stay here and be safe? Can I keep my kids safe? Because this might be the safest thing for me right now.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's say, gosh, it's not me, and I didn't grow up in it, but I've got a girlfriend, or I have a niece who I'm afraid for. How do we recognize the signs, and how do we? What do we say, and how do we address it?
Yeah, you pointed out earlier that violence escalates, right? So we know that he didn't hit her right away. There were experiences of emotional and verbal abuse that escalated, and then, physical abuse or something like that may occur. Although there are many abusive relationships where physical abuse never happens, right? So I would say that some of the first warning signs, or some of the things that might be obvious to those around her, are what we believe the first kind of red flags and experiences of abuse are, and that is isolation. So he begins to strategically and slowly cut her off from her relationships, her supportive people around her. He does it in the beginning really sweet, because he says things like, I love you so much. Let's not go to that thing with your family. I just want it to be us.
Yeah.
Or he starts to put a wedge between her and her family with conflicts. No family's perfect. We all have issues.
Right.
But he plays on those to kind of create a wedge. And so if you notice somebody is really growing distant and really kind of isolating from the family or from friends or from everybody, it's really a warning sign that something might be going on. At its best, it's unhealthy. At its worst, it might be abusive. I would also put out there that the anxiety oftentimes can be seen if you're looking for it. It is normal to be frustrated in a relationship. Can I get an amen? Right? Like,
Yes.
normal to feel mad
Let the people
in
say amen.
marriage. But it's not normal to feel afraid. It's not normal to be so concerned about what my partner is going to feel. Oh, if I don't do this, he's going to be mad, that I'm anxious about it, right? And so if you see her, if you're trying to have lunch with her and her partner's texting or calling her, and you see her anxious about having to return the call.
I've got to do it now. I've got to text the text. I was in the grocery store one day, and I was with a lady, and she was going through boxes of eggs. And she said, I have to be sure that they're not out of date. And I said, I didn't know there was a date on eggs. I just thought you bought the eggs and you eat them and you get more eggs, right? And she said, if I bring home a box of eggs, there is no way I could bring home a box of eggs where the date wasn't at least a week out. And I remember thinking at the time, it was before I started working here, but that has stuck with me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I should have just realized that was just kind of a sign of this anxiousness of, I am at the grocery store. I'm allowed to spend this, but what's the rest of the story there,
We
right?
believe there's
That
such
should be
unhealthy
weird.
dynamic there if you're
Yeah,
anxious
yeah.
about this, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't like for my husband to be angry, but I'm not afraid of him being angry.
Right.
If I'm afraid of my husband being upset, something else is
That's
going
the
on
difference,
there.
don't you think?
Absolutely.
Is when she is afraid. I was talking with the University Park Police. There was a woman that we were working with, and I had stopped by the police department to say, you know, I'm very, very worried about her. We were seeing her on a non-residential basis, and I said, if you would just go by, he's escalating, check on her. And he goes, the corporal said, you know, that was weird. He said, I got a call from her the other day, and so we went by. She called 911, and they were out in the front yard, and she was saying that it was her book club day, and he wanted the yard man to scalp the yard just for the seasonal yard scalping. And she said, please don't do it today. I don't want the yard to look brown. I've worked real hard for my garden club or whatever was coming. And he was like, you know, no, I do this when I want to do it, and we're going to scalp the yard today. And I thought, of course it's today, right? So anyway, the police corporal kind of drove off, and I said, what'd you do? And he goes, well, I just left. And I said, let me ask you this. When do I call the police? When I need landscaping advice? No. When do I call the police, guys? When I'm afraid, absolutely. So we have to look beyond what those excuses are and what those bruises are.
And what we understand, Jan, is that she's an expert on him.
Yes.
So she has spent her entire relationship learning him, learning his moods, learning what's going on to try to perceive when the threat is happening or when it's escalating to get in front of it and protect herself. So if she's upset about this yard thing, and it's because she is already concerned that it's going to go to here.
Right.
And so let me get the police involved now to calm it down or
Right.
oftentimes again, it's okay to admit that sometimes they do things that we don't understand, and we're like, what is that?
Right.
It's protective, and oftentimes it's
Yeah.
trying to get ahead of the threat.
Maybe it was a safe time for her to call the police, and that it was over the yard and not wait until something bad happened. Like she wanted the police to be in her world, and that was the only way she knew how to do it. I don't know if
Absolutely.
you saw that Super Bowl ad a couple of years ago where it was somebody ordering pizza, and they dialed 911 and ordered the pizza and said, you know, oh, ma'am, do you realize you called 911? Yes, I do. Could you deliver that pizza really quickly? We're, you know, watching the game and we need to whatever. And finally, they got it. They got it. But at first, you can imagine just a 911 person thinking, oh my gosh, lady, you are
Calling
drunk.
about
Yeah,
pizza,
we're calling
right.
about pizza. That's super crazy. But maybe that's how we can safely ask for help. I do want to spend just a few minutes with asking for questions that you guys might have.
Absolutely.
And Paul's got a microphone that if you want to just kind of clear up any of this or share an experience or know more about Genesis or this issue or us or anything.
Let me start with one.
Yeah.
I had a good friend who was recently married to an abuser, and she ended up, you know, unconscious on the floor, and but she was able to call 911 before he knocked her out. Didn't get to speak to anyone, so the police came out. So that event ends with her in an ambulance going to the hospital and him leaving in handcuffs. And yet at some point she decided that she didn't want to be part of the prosecution. Is that sort
Right.
of the trauma that follows the trauma, that she didn't want to go through that trauma
well,
again?
Yeah. The question being, why wouldn't she participate? He knocked her out. I mean, she was unconscious on the floor, and she had the wherewithal to call. But let me tell you, there are so many things that go on with regards to that prosecution. I don't want the neighbors to see a cop at my house. I don't want to go down to the courthouse where I walk in, they say there's not enough evidence, and I go home with the guy. Do you know how much danger I'm in if it's found that he was not guilty or not enough evidence, or the county of Dallas didn't prosecute because of a glitch? That's another safety protection that she wouldn't want to prosecute. And I think we get to that point where it's like, I just want this to be over. I just want this to be over. And so there may be a lot of reasons she wouldn't participate in the prosecution.
I had a client last year whose abuser got arrested and then bailed out, and so within 24 hours was released. They gave him an emergency protective order, so a piece of paper saying that it was against the law for him to be around her or have any contact with her. And he walked from the jail with the emergency protective order in his back pocket to her house, broke in the front door and attacked her again. And so I hear about a lot of clients who will tell me, it keeps me safer if I can say I didn't help them.
It wasn't me. I
tell
didn't go
them
down and get him.
anything.
Yeah, I went down and I bailed him out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, sometimes those of us that are not in the legal system, judge with respect, it's a really long process.
Yeah.
It could be like up to a year before she actually gets into a court. And so you can imagine what she's experienced for that year. And then they're wanting her to come in front of the court and testify and do. So oftentimes it's just, maybe she doesn't even have contact with him. Maybe she's not in the relationship
Right.
with him, but she just wants to move on with her
Right.
life. She just wants to move forward.
That
So there's
timing
a lot of reasons.
makes a lot of sense. Think about that. I can't remember what happened a year ago today. I can't remember it at all. And there have been so many assaults before and since, but we're only talking on that day 1 year later in that courtroom about that assault. I'm going to come off looking like a terrible witness, that I don't understand it. I mean, it's a difficult process.
Or a year of him being in the honeymoon phase.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
he's
yeah,
apologized
yeah.
and said it'll never happen
He's
again.
moved into contemplation, that's for sure,
Or a
right?
year of him threatening and saying,
Yeah.
there's a lot of really complicated dynamics that could occur. I think it's oftentimes when we see somebody do something and we're like, why is that? There can be a lot into the context and the
Right.
history there.
I remember going to testify one time, and again, I go in as an experiential expert, and so I don't know her and I don't know him, and I just talk about the issue. Well, I did know enough in this particular case that he had threatened the woman, if you testify, I'll come and I'll kill you. If somebody testifies on your behalf, I'm going to go kill them. And if I go to jail and I can't kill you, I'm going to have my family kill your family. So, I mean, it was pretty clear this guy is pretty dangerous, right? And so the couple was Hispanic. And when I got to court that day, I was just thinking about the next thing I'm supposed to do, and this is what I do, and I walked in there. And I remember sitting up on the stand like I'm sitting here, and I looked out, and there wasn't anybody in the gallery, right, except one lone Hispanic man sitting there staring at me. And I thought, uh-oh, this is not good, right? And again, remember me? I got no dog in this hunt. I don't know him, but this is just what I do. And so I remember the court reporter saying, will you state your name? And I was like, Jan Langbein, They're like, spell that for me. And I'm like, I'd rather not, kind of deal. Anyway, I thought, well, the jig's up now, and I'm just going to do the best I can. And so I testified that day and shared whatever I could to help the jury and the judge understand the dynamics and the manipulation in court and so on and so forth. So I was done. They dismissed me. And I don't know if you've ever been down to the Dallas County Courthouse, but as you leave the courtrooms, the restroom is just on the other side of the elevator. And so I go in, I use the ladies' room, and I come back out, and man, it's just me and that lone man standing at that elevator. And I thought, man, do you yell fire? Do you walk away? Do you whatever? And this man looks at me and he says, you just testified in that court case, didn't you? And I said, what is it you want? And he said, didn't you just testify? And I got out my mama's finger. Why I think that makes me safer, I don't know. But I'm like, I need you to step back from me right now. And he looks with tears coming down his face, and he said, that's my daughter, and no one had the courage but you to stand up for her. I'm like, oh, first of all, I'm like, thank you, God, whatever. But then I thought, hey, again, if not us, then whom? Who's going to do this for her? Anyway, that was just some thoughts that we had. Any other questions that you might have, Your
Yes,
Honor?
I have one. Obviously, from what you've said, the court system has not been very effective in changing behavior.
Right.
Is anything being done outside the court system to focus on the abuser and to
Yes, sir.
affect this change?
Yeah, so what are we doing about the abuser? And truthfully, Genesis does not provide batterers. We don't provide services to men who batter. But we do partner with organizations like the Family Place and New Beginning in Garland that have programs called Batters Intervention and Prevention. And it's about a 12-week program that is court-ordered. Only about 1% go on their own, and that's usually because they're fixing to go to court. But the court orders them to go to this session. It's almost like a 12-step, if you think about it, people sitting around the room, and they are able to sit through, you're the cause of this, and you have to say, I'm Fred, and I beat my wife. And to me, I don't think you get to go to counseling you wouldn't send me to counseling if I stole your car. So why is it this other crime just gets to go and talk about how it felt when he punched me in the face, right? But at least it's accountability. At least it's somebody saying, you did something wrong and you're gonna go try to be better at this. It's much better than throwing him in jail with, where he drinks, warm Kool-Aid and eats low-bid bologna sandwiches. I mean, now he's just really mad when he gets out of there. Why did you send me to jail instead of of why did you send him to jail? But yes, I think with accountability, with zero tolerance, with lay people. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. I talked about our heroes group. When men say, I'm not going to play golf with you because I don't like how you treat your wife. We don't praise this person. We don't let him be on boards of the Y and the Boy Scouts. We say, you don't get to do that because of your behavior. When we begin to hold them accountable, that's when that will change, I think.
Yeah, we know one of the most important things for abusers through a bunch of research that's been done is kind of their social identity and how they look. So we call it social engineering, and they actually have a lot of effort and energy focused in how they look. So I have a lot of clients that talk about how long he takes to get dressed, that he really cares about his clothes or his hair, but they also really care about their image, so they join the Little League team and coach the team, or they're a deacon in the church, or they're purposely getting these places of charitable kind of situations, or really kind of situations where people would really look at them and go, oh, Bob, it can't be Bob. He's such a nice guy. He does this, right? And so we know that social engineering is so important to abusers because it is the way in which they hide their abusive tactics. And so what we know would actually be really effective in stopping them is to dismantle the social engineering, to hold them accountable and not let them be on the board, to not let them be the coach of the baseball team, for friends in the neighborhood to say, like, you talk to your wife this way, and I'm not willing to be friends with you when you're going to talk this way. This is not appropriate.
There was a very affluent man who at one point, I don't think he is anymore, but was a member of Lovers Lane Methodist Church, incredibly abusive. And the Boy Scouts were about to give him Father of the Year award. And I got to tell you, I don't know where this came from, but somebody who looks and sounds a lot like me called Pat Curry over at the Boy Scouts, and I just said, as one CEO to another, you're going to look like an idiot when this comes out, because this man has no right to be called Father of the Year. Barbara Markham last night at the dinner was talking about, one of your new pastors was talking about a man at Highland Park Methodist who had made a big pledge. Church returned it. And I'm like, whoa. You start thinking about you returning money. Oh my gosh. But then at the end of the day, you don't get to do this. You don't get to do this. I did mention in the chapel yesterday morning about the death of Mary Williams Richardson, who Tim Richardson went to church on Sunday morning at St. Michael, and he came home and he murdered Mary that day. And I remember the family. Not only are they devastated, but Tim is in jail, right? Tim, the murderer, is in Frank Crowley. And when did you visit me in prison? When did I serve, the least of these kind of thing? And the church did minister to Tim, not in a forgiveness way. It's not forgive and forget. It's forgive and hold accountable. But the family felt so betrayed by the faith response to the man who killed and devastated their family. So it's a tough place to be. But you got to do it. You got to hold it accountable.
Yeah, I think it's especially hard for churches because, again, we do believe in forgiveness and we do believe in redemption. But I do think the church is a really unique and powerful place because we can say, as long as you're doing these things, you aren't welcome.
You don't get to.
You
don't get to teach Sunday school. You don't get to teach MYF.
And when you change and when you're ready for help, we're here and we love you and we'll support you. But as long as you're doing this, we cannot be a part of that.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Mike is over there, and I said, wait, let's do
I
one
just
minute.
wanted to know if you had cards with Genesis number.
We do. We have a lot of information on the back. Thank you for bringing that up.
I'm talking about a card.
Oh, yes, we do. We have small palm cards as well. I don't know if there are any back there.
No,
but
they're not, because I've been looking for them.
Okay. Our office on Lemon Avenue, and the address is on the back of the brochure, can tell you. We're happy to give them to you. We'll talk to your church about take off our name and print Lover's Lane on it to personalize them. And you can print these in-house. They're easy to do.
I really like the cards that I see often on the back of the bathrooms.
Yeah, somebody mentioned it to me yesterday, Paul, that you all had those things in there, and I see a Velcro piece in there, but it's gone. We recommend in men and women's restrooms is someone you love hurting you, and it's just a resource card she can stick in a diaper bag. He can grab and give to his daughter or his granddaughter who needs the help. But we can get those, or we can show you how to design your own. It's very, very easy. It's a very cheap print job.
We'll go here and then over there next.
Okay.
You haven't mentioned same-sex relationships.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Same-sex relationships.
Oh,
So what we know is that Overwhelmingly, the occurrences of domestic violence happen by a hetero male against a hetero female, but we do see absolutely domestic violence occurring in same-sex relationships, particularly in the transgendered community. The stats can be pretty high. And we would put forward that the reason in same-sex relationships, power and control exists because you have kind of an equal power spot, and then somebody can dominate either financially, physically, because someone's bigger than the other, things like this, status within the community. So we do see it within the same-sex community. Of course, we see men who are abused by women, but we tend to use the language of she as a victim and he as an abuser, because overwhelmingly what's happening in our society is men who are abusing women.
Right. And our services are for battered women, regardless of the gender of their abusers. We do not provide services to men who batter or men who are battered, but we absolutely are in a network that would refer that.
I think front.
Where does one start when you know someone is isolated with a controlling male?
You know, I would tell you that if you're ever concerned about somebody, about a friend or a loved one, the place to start is just to go to her in a safe way. So you're not going to go to her in front of him, but in a way that you can go to her independently and separate, and just to say, I'm really worried about you. I'm really concerned. You seem to be isolating. I feel like we haven't had a lot of talk and time together, and I just want you to know that I love you and I'm really worried about you. When people isolate or they tend to do these things, we sometimes get mad, and then we tend to go to them in our anger. And when we do that, she's going to feel really blamed and shamed by that, and it's going to actually push her away further. It's going to actually feed into a lot of the things he was saying and the way he was able to create the wedge in the first place. And so it's going to be really important that we just go with a language of, I'm worried about you, and I really care for you, and when you're ready, I'm here.
And so don't you think, too, sometimes depending on the relationship, I'll use the third person, like, oh my gosh, you know, Jordan, I was at church yesterday, and I heard this little white-haired woman go on and on for like 4 services about how prevalent this is and how scary it is and some of the dynamics. And I got to tell you, I got to thinking about you again and again. And I know this may not be right, but I just want you to know if it is, and it's so prevalent, I'm here for you. You know, kind of putting it on somebody else.
Yeah, this is such an intimate and personal thing. People are really embarrassed. People feel really ashamed. And so if we go in saying, I think your husband's terrible, and she might get really kind of protective and guarded. So we want to go in really non-judgmental and really just promoting that language of, I'm worried about you. One of the things at Genesis that we say is that we're not neutral on safety. We have a lot of women who come to our agency very unsure about what's going on in the relationship, very much still wanting to be in the relationship. And so again, I'm not going to come forward with, you need to leave now, he's awful. I'm going to be very kind of caring and general with her, but I'm not neutral on safety. So when I know something's going on, I call it and I say, I see this and I'm really worried about you. I see how you're afraid of him or how you get anxious when he does this. And I have to tell you, I don't think that that's normal in a healthy relationship, and I'm really concerned about you.
You know, that's talking about, and that's a pretty quick answer for a real problem. So if we can help, we want to. But talking about what congregations can do together to help raise the awareness. What if the UMYF benefited Genesis Women's Shelter? Now, yes, we love funds, of course, but what if a flyer went home to every family where these kids live and said, is someone you love hurting you? The teens of LLUMC are washing our hands of abusers or something, something cute to where these things are now home in the hands of somebody who may need the help. If you or someone you know needs help. It's nice that you guys have put boxes out there for socks and underwear, but what if you guys did a church-wide drive? Yes, I love the stuff, but, and we started talking about this a little bit last night, there's a flyer back there of when you donate to the Benefit Thrift Store, and a lot of you guys do that. You pull up with your gently used clothing, things that we can give away to our clients, but also men's clothing or things like a wedding dress that we can't use, but we sell that. That actually goes to emergency client assistance, which can replace a pair of glasses that got broken when he smacked her in the face. What if this church did a church-wide drive so that everyone knew you take a zero-tolerance stand on this, and that information was not generated out into the homes, but generated out into the homes. What other church-wide things can you guys do that would just subtly raise awareness about this?
What about, have y'all had to deal at all with transgender issues?
We do. Transgender issue is huge. You touched a little bit on it with the LGBT community. The T is the trans, and we have women who identify as women. It's not a surgical change, it's their identification. And I'm very proud of Genesis. We wrote a residential policy before we ever had to. We don't take government funds, and so I didn't have to write that policy, but we recognize that transgendered women are at high risk of being abused, and there's certain stipulations. You can't change that identity while you're in the house. If you work at Chase Bank and they think you're a man and you dress as a man at work, you can't dress as a man when you come home from work. You have to be consistent in that identification. But we've done it. We've had people come in, and I got to tell you, it works. At first we thought, well, what about somebody I'm worried about who's in the stall next to me? Maybe somebody else wouldn't stay there because, man, I don't know who's in the stall next to me here at the church.
My experience is that people want people to be safe.
That
And
people
if
want people to be
somebody
safe.
Is in danger, they want her to be in a safe place, and so they work it out.
The only bump we had was a little child who said, "Mommy, I think that lady is a man," and the mom handled it beautifully. She said, "No, honey, that's a woman. That's a woman." And the little child was, "Okay, that's fine with me then." I mean, from her mouth to God's ear, right? I mean,
It is an
these kids
important
get it,
community to reach out to, because the statistics are so alarming and so high in rates of violence and rates of being murdered. And that's not just in domestic violence, but due to hate crimes in the community. So.
We have run out of time, and I'm going to turn this back to you, Paul. I have loved my time with the McCormick Speaker Series, and I am honored that out of all the lay people you could pick, or maybe you called them and they were busy or something, but I so appreciate. I don't care if I'm second fiddle as long as I'm in the band, okay?
I agree. We're so grateful
you.
that you were here, and when we started planning this event, you were the first name that came to mind, and I was almost a little embarrassed that I didn't think of your name sooner, because I know you so well.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming. Jordan, thank you for being
Thank you
here
for
today.
having me.
Thank all of y'all for coming. This is such a wonderful event. We'll be our next gathering will be in January for our annual donor dinner, our donor appreciation dinner, where we will recognize our Cross and Crown Award honorees, Mike and Catherine Phillips, and Dan and Margaret Strothers. So hope y'all be looking for that. And then we'll be here during the Owen Linton Lecture Series, during a Holy Week. And then we'll be back here next fall with our SHIP Lecture Series. So we hope you will come and join us. Again, thank you all so much for being here.
A pleasure to meet you. Thank you.